So yeah, just to introduce myself, my name's Pete Barbrook-Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of Agile. I'm also a lecturer over in geography. The aim of this panel is to explore this kind of question of where are we at or what have we done well. So it's really taking stock of what we've already been doing and what others have been doing in this space of really applied, rapid, policy-focused research. So I'm going to get kind of overarching questions on kind of, where are we at and what have we learned? And I really do want to pull out these kind of practical lessons about what we've learned, what's worked and what hasn't. In terms of structure, we've got 3 panelists who are going to say a few words at first, maybe kind of 5-10 minutes, give us an overview of some of their work. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and add in a few more thoughts as well myself, and then we'll open up for discussion. And so we've got kind of, an hour and 45 or so at least. So we've got the idea was to give lots of time for discussion, lots of questions, hopefully to get your thinking caps on. And yeah, we'll go to about 1:30. We can finish a bit early if we feel like if it kind of naturally comes to end, we can go and have lunch about 1. And so yeah, our 3 speakers are Aline Soterroni, who's a research fellow in Nature-Based Solutions Initiative and Oxford Net Zero Initiative at Oxford. We have Carlo Palazzi, who's a DPhil student in engineering, who's worked very closely on the green ammonia sprint, the shipping sprint in Agile. And then we have Anupama, who is the head of policy engagement in the Smith School here at Oxford, and he's slightly less connected to Agile, although we have tentacles everywhere, so there is some connection there. So yeah, I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Alina. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. And yeah, just to clarify, we'll have, if there's clarification questions for Alina, we can take those straight after rather than waiting.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. My sprint was the Science to Policy mini sprint, How Can Brazil Reach Net Zero Emissions, that ran from February to September last year. And my sprint team was Natalie Seddon, Michael Bersteiner, and I. And before sharing the lessons learned, I'd like to start giving some steps back and explaining why we decided to tackle this research question, the major findings, and how the work evolved. So why? Let me share a little bit of context. In 2021, Brazil's president was Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro's government submitted to the UNFCCC an NEDC that violated the progression and non-regression principles of the Paris Agreement. It was considered highly insufficient, and in COP26 in Glasgow, Bolsonaro's government made bold commitments, such as achieving net zero GHG emissions by mid-century, and also signed the Methane Pledge, the Glasgow Forest Pledge. But at the same time, the government was committing to end deforestation. The Amazon deforestation rates were achieved a 15-year high. So, and the deforestation alerts were spread all over the country. And it's important to mention that while globally 3/4 of emissions are energy related, in Brazil is the other way around. 3/4 of emissions are land use related, and deforestation is the single largest source of emissions in Brazil. So we knew that the government in place was not going to deliver on its promises. So it was the context, and we decided to answer this question and call attention to that. And to this end, we were using the data sets and the models that we had at hand. I'm a land use modeler with experience in regionalizing global land use models for Brazil for quite some time. And for this work, we also combined models, our model with another model, an energy model from a Brazilian institution to create an integrated assessment regional modeling approach. So we answered this question with scenarios modeling for policy evaluation. And in terms of main findings, we projected policies into emissions trajectories. We got deforestation trajectories as well. But in a nutshell, we found that nature-based solutions could mitigate nearly 80% of Brazil's net zero pledge. And but it requires the end of deforestation and also large-scale native vegetation restoration. And if Brazil journey to net zero is grounded in NBS, the country could stay on a clear path during the next 20 years without the need to deploy negative, costly and not yet mature negative emissions technologies. And to this end, it needs in the first decade to bridge the implementation gap, so implement the existing policies, then move on to the ambition gap and go beyond the existing policies, and finally deploy negative emissions technologies. And needless to say, Brazil is a mega diverse country. It hosts 60% of the Amazon and 20% of the world's biological diversity. So what happens in Brazil also affects the entire biosphere. And by achieving net zero with nature-based solutions, Brazil could also curb biodiversity loss, adapt and create resilience. So we had outputs to communicate with local government and also with global stakeholders. And now moving on how things evolved in our sprint. So it ran from February to September. We were doing the modeling work, refining our results most of the time. In terms of policy window, we had in 2022 the Brazil's presidential election, which was really polarized, and the communication with the current government back that time was hard, so that's why we started to engage with DEFRA. In terms of outputs, our first preliminary results were shared in the NBS conference in July. We also communicated our results in a webinar under the Oxford Net Zero Fellows webinar series. We had the honor to have the former Minister of the Environment, Isabella Teixeira, and also Professor Roberto Scheffer and Tasso Azevedo from MAP Biomas. So this work and the elections coming, this policy window, got a lot of attention to our work, so we started to engage with media outlets. In November, Lula was elected. After the elections, I was interviewed by Nature, and we had the first final version of our results were out in November. And we put it in a preprint, and we created a policy brief because we wanted to communicate those results with the new government. So a new window of a policy window was open, which was to engage with the new elected government. So went to COP, we started our engagement there, and the sprint was run from February to September, but as you can see, it didn't stop last year, and it continues until this year. So first thing we've done this year was to engage with the new government. So in January, I went to Brasilia, and I engaged particularly with the Minister of Science and Technology, which is responsible for emissions inventories in the country. During this year, I was invited to attend and speak at several events. So I had the opportunity to communicate our results done during the Agile Sprint with academia, politicians, diplomats, private sector, civil society. The paper, the scientific publication, came out only in September, 1 year after the end of the sprint. And I was also invited to be part of a project, a platform from Ministry of Science and Technology in Brazil called Synapse. And this platform basically is a national simulator of public policies translated into emissions trajectories. And the outcomes of this project or this platform is to inform policies in Brazil and also the update of the NDC. So now I'm seconded to Brazil's government working on this Synapse platform. I'm going to COP28 as a Brazil delegate. So I got the governmental badge. I have a pink badge to go there. And the work is not going to stop now. It will continue. We have another policy window open, which is the update of Brazil's NDC towards COP30 in Belém. So it continues. And in a nutshell, to share to summarize what has worked and what were the challenges, I would say that the existing data sets and the regional integrated assessment modeling we built, it was well established, so we didn't need to create those models. We had the expertise at hand, so it was fundamental. Also the clear policy windows, the previous network with key partners and stakeholders. Prior to Oxford, I was in Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, which is an institute connected to the Ministry of Science and Technology. In the first NDC, Brazil's NDC, I was part of a research group that advised the Brazil's government, but back that time I was only doing modeling, and this time we were doing a little bit of everything. And the work with DEFRA, that was particularly important during Bolsonaro's government, and the communication was difficult. So in terms of challenges, the engagement with the government, previous government, was almost impossible. I would also like to highlight the long peer-reviewed publication process, which is pretty challenging for academics that are measured by publications. And final but not least, the small team, amazing team, Nat, Mikhail. I also had the support of the engine team, engine room, especially Luce Rodwell, but we were too small to carry out all the stages of the work plan, like modeling, soft linking the different models, designing, running, analyzing the results, doing stakeholders engagement, the scientific publication, the policy brief, the media interviews, the meetings, and the seminars, all of this together. Thank you for your attention. I hope I have shared some insightful experience, and happy to help to answer the questions you may have. Thank you.
Kind of clarification or immediate questions? I think I'm keen that we kind of keep the discussion rather than us just talking at you for 40 minutes. Could I ask one, that something you said that really jumped out to me? You said before, when you were doing, in a previous institution in Brazil, you were doing lots of modeling work, and you were like, I'm just doing the modeling, and now I'm doing the modeling and lots of other stuff, and that's a challenge, maybe.
Yeah.
What was that other stuff? I mean, is it all this engagement work, or is there more to it? Or why is that?
The engagement, basically the engagement, the media interviews, and how to adjust the language, because I'm still used to talk to researchers, and when we talk to civil society or to politicians, you have to adjust your language. You cannot come there and talk about all the uncertainties and, intervals of things like that. So you have to learn that. And yeah, it was basically all these things that I listed, the seminars, the media interviews, the engagement with policymakers, but also the modeling work, also communicating with my team and leading the scientific publication. And the sprint was only 6 months. It was a mini sprint.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aline. Question?
Thank you very much for that. That was brilliant. My attention got on the change of government, and I was going to ask, how did you manage, or did you have to change the language based on the political color of the new government? Because you've been saying that you need to tailor the language to speak to policymakers or to the civil society, but then within the policymakers there's a spectrum, right, of sensibilities to certain topics rather than others. So did you witness also a change of language based on the new government, and was the kind of the sprint model ready to adjust to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So before the presidential election, we had Bolsonaro government, and it was really hard to come back there and say you have to end deforestation. Your commitments, they are not backed in robust science. So we were, back that time, we were more communicating with global stakeholders, DEFRA. So it was one point, and yes, to adjust the language. And with the change in government, we found more space to communicate our findings. But since we have plenty of scenarios, it gives us flexibility to use more one scenario to talk to one audience, or use other scenarios to talk to another audience. So we have this, within our results, we could shape and adjust the language a little bit.
I've had a little bit of experience working in Brazil, or with Brazilian academics, and I've been sat in my desk in Oxford being really keen and saying, guys, come on, let's do more engagement. This was a couple of years ago. Let's push our modelling work. Let's go speak to the civil servants. And I've had to really adjust my sense of like what our tactics should be, from let's be engagement, and as Catherine was talking about, let's go and talk to people, build the relationships. And I've kind of, but no, when the political level is not favourable at all, you have to almost like bide your time, think about other partners. Yeah, kind of almost kind of really hold your gunpowder, like don't go too fast, because you could create problems. And so that when the political level is different, then the way you engage with the civil service then can shift as
Yes.
Brazil's a very good example of that.
Yes, just last point. When I was in Brazil prior to come to Oxford, I was at INPE. Basically, we were communicating how the deforestation would affect agriculture. That was our way to communicate with government. So the losses in production due to biodiversity losses, not really on ending deforestation, doing native vegetation restoration. So we had to also adjust in this sense. But hopefully now we have more space, and let's see. It's also management of expectations. We provide science-based results, but at the end, the decision is political.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alina. We'll have much more time for questions to Sue. So next we have Carlo. Over to you, Carlo. Thank you.
Grand. Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name's Carlo. I am starting a DPhil here at Oxford on green ammonia energy systems, and I worked as part of the shipping decarbonisation through green ammonia sprint last year. Before starting my DPhil, having read my application for that, the researchers that had set up this sprint thought, you know what, you could start a bit early, and got me involved on this project. To give you a bit of an introduction to that, basically, shipping accounts for 3% of global emissions, but as a very important sector, it underpins about 90% of international trade, and it's always been considered quite a hard sector to decarbonize because the energy density required for these kind of long-haul voyages is far beyond what's achievable by battery technology, although there is some potential for kind of shorter distance travel to be done with that. There's a team at Oxford that's been historically looking at the production of green ammonia. Ammonia, you probably know, as being the key ingredient in our fertilizer, and that is mostly actually coming from hydrocarbon industry. The hydrogen for that ammonia has historically come from hydrocarbons. But there's this team at Oxford that's been looking at green ammonia production for at least the last 5-6 years. And when this kind of initiative appeared, it started to become apparent that ammonia was actually something we could consider to be a potential fuel for shipping. And that might sound strange to people that have never come across this before, but actually, you know, ammonia has been used as fuel from as far back as World War II, when diesel prices were high, Belgium suddenly started running buses on ammonia. It wasn't green ammonia, it was very much hydrocarbon derived then. But we now know that we can make ammonia from hydrogen, from splitting water, using renewable energy and pulling nitrogen from the air. And when you combust it or put it in a fuel cell, then you just get back that nitrogen and water that you got it from. So we could use green ammonia for our shipping fuel. It's one of the options that's being most looked at now. And the goal of the sprint was really to create the first spatially explicit optimization of international shipping running on green ammonia. So that required some expertise in kind of the shipping industry and being able to model what shipping demand might be in the future and where that fuel would have to go. It required expertise in the production of green ammonia to be able to model the costs that was going to have and the delivery costs that was going to have to be delivered to ships. And it required some kind of policy expertise to be able to engage the right people to make sure we were asking the right questions and delivering the right solutions and delivering them to where they were most needed. And so I can quickly show you who the people that made up this team were. Well, there we go, that was one of the results. So we had people on the production, such as Rene. We had Anupama, who was very much involved with our sprint, leading kind of the policy side. Jim Hall, who heads up the Environmental Change Institute, OPSIS team, and kind of being involved in the spatial and geographical side, leading researchers such as Jasper Verschoor, who did most of the modeling work on the shipping trade and forecasting where there was going to be fuel required, and Nick Salmon, who built most of the model that we use for this project, with additions from myself and other colleagues such as Aman. And what the model looked like after we built it, this was kind of the results. You can see in green potential ammonia production sites, in red demand ports. All of that's been modeled through, and the idea was to give an estimate of how much it might cost to be able to run this entire system of ships that are going to bunker at, you know, the famous bunkering sites, so like Singapore in Southeast Asia, Rotterdam in Europe. Where would be the cheapest place to source green ammonia from these? Having these results, and results is kind of a big word. It's a model that we can tweak parameters of, and there's a lot of uncertainty in them. And we want to know actually from stakeholders what would you want the parameters to be? What would you want to find out, given that we have a model like this? And that was the starting point for engaging with industry stakeholders and with government. And that's when my second role in the project came in, as well as helping out with doing the modeling and the research. I started acting as policy liaison officer, going into the Department for Transport and essentially trying to co-design where our research was going to go. You know, in very much the way that Catherine presented earlier, they were very receptive to this. The starting point for it was, we thought, what's the best way of getting this information out there and getting our stakeholders involved and seeing where we can take this. And so we had this model within about the first 6-7 months. Then we were able to host a workshop where, Anupama and Jim and Rene and senior members of the team used their contacts to try and invite as many people that might be interested in this as possible. That ranged from industry, there were fuel producers, shipping companies, to government, where we invited DFT and other international stakeholders. We had representatives from the from the World Bank coming, and we put in a big organizational effort to make this workshop, and it was a really good starting point for seeing who might actually have interest enough to keep engaging with us over the next 6 months. And we had lots of great feedback within that workshop, such as being told, this is quite a new space. We don't exactly know what we'd want in terms of input parameters and what cost might make a difference. We want you to tell us, actually, if you tweak all of these inputs, what is the minimum, minimum government investment required to make ammonia cheaper than current fuels and things like that. So it even informed the modelling very early on, just from that single workshop. But after that, we really had engagement with the Department for Transport, specifically the UK Shipping Office for reducing emissions, which somebody must have been really patting themselves on the back when they came up with that acronym, because UK Shore is a great name for a shipping emissions reduction team. And so my role as policy liaison officer with them meant we started having conversations, and it got to the stage where after the workshop we started saying, look, we'd be able to work with you kind of on a weekly basis, a fortnightly basis for the next 6 months. Would that be something you're interested in? And they said, yes, absolutely. How much is it going to cost? It might take us a decade to get clearance for that. And we said, it's going to be free because it's all funded by the Agile project. And they were like, amazing, okay, let's start. And there were delays. They initially said, in 2 weeks' time, come into DFT, and it ended up being in 5 weeks' time. But that's much, much quicker than the experience that I imagine a lot of other teams in the past have had in trying to embed somebody in a government team. So literally being able to go and say, we're happy to offer support, they were immediately receptive, but the fact that we could give that for free as part of the research project we were trying to do, because it had policy impact built in as one of the deliverables, was they were immensely grateful for. And the way that then worked was, initially went into DFT every couple of weeks in person, speaking with Alexandra Beaumont, who's the head of UK Shore. She was very much making sure that I'd meet up with all of the relevant people around the department. That meant people that were working on kind of the financial forecasting of some of the decarbonisation projects that they have, such as the Zero Emission Vehicle Incentive, and a couple of other funds that they run. UK Shore is essentially like a big fund that people can apply for project funding for. And after having met a few of the key stakeholders around the department, which is quite tricky given that actually there's lots of teams that are a bit dislocated and don't themselves regularly communicate. For them, I think it was quite helpful having somebody come in and make sure, all of these people actually have a connection, and what we should try and do is make sure that within this project, you're coming in every couple of weeks, we set a couple of key workshops to get everybody involved across the department, to come and see what you're doing and agree on some of the deliverables. So we used this opportunity with DFT to ask them, okay, what is it that you would like us to do with this model? We have this model, we have these capabilities. It was great to go in and say, we have a clear tool that we could use to get some results for you, rather than say, we could offer everything and we don't really know where the research is going. We have this quite limited but very useful tool, and you could help direct it. They, already said, okay, we to be honest have no idea, but given that they've got these kind of limits to what could be done with the model, that actually I think gave them a slight creative constraint, because they wanted information on everything. It's a very open space. Shipping decarbonisation, that there's no really clear direction on it at the moment, and in some ways they were hoping we'd come in and set a direction, but we can't do that. But we had this kind of limited but useful tool for specifically green ammonia, and they said, okay, actually there is something here we could work with. And essentially we were able to co-design, aligning some of the things that we were interested in research-wise, which was quite say there were 100 things we could have looked at, and then they suggested 95 things that they would have liked us to look at, and we said, okay, there's 5 there that in 6 months actually we would be able to produce. And we did that through these workshops that involved both UK Shore and some of the people that they'd arranged from sometimes other departments as well. We had a couple of people from the Department for Business and from Energy step in. and then actually work closely with the academic advisor on shipping to make sure that as we researched those agreed deliverables, which were essentially a kind of slightly UK-focused version of this global model, we had someone to check in with and then get back to kind of the more senior stakeholders at the end of the sprint when some of that had been finalized and we had some results. So I think it was a really useful experience, and I'll chat more about it on the panel. The work from it hasn't quite finished because, again, publication times kind of stretch everything, but that relationship that we have with DFT is definitely going to continue with the work that I'll be doing throughout my DPhil, because this space in kind of energy and green ammonia and shipping isn't disappearing. That team is going to be there, and the Agile Sprint really enabled that relationship to be set up and give us that confidence to interact with the department. Yeah. Any questions, I think, right now, if we've got time?
Looking at the map, actually, how did you choose your production site?
The production sites are optimized based on where it would be technologically cheapest to produce, which basically means where is the best solar resource, which does mean that, West Africa, which might not be realistically the first production site that people would invest in, comes up in the model. This is the base run of the model where we just say, there's no kind of restrictions on where the fuel might come from, more kind of international relation considerations or from kind of more sophisticated investment considerations. It's just if you had, technological costs the same everywhere, where's the best resource and the best, cheapest solar and greatest land availability for building solar plants is in that kind of equatorial band. And West Africa is well suited for delivery to Europe, which is where a lot of the production happens there.
And if I can follow up, what would be a realistic map?
More realistic map than this? Well, there's a lot that could happen. This is a 2050 scenario, so there's a lot that could happen between now and then that might make the political situation more favorable for investment in that area. All of those things could happen. The things that we're planning at the moment, and the UK asked us to, the DFT, for example, asked us to focus on is, what if we introduce in the model greater subsidy for offshore wind, and also include in the model some degree of fuel independence. So 30% fuel independence for the UK, for example, would have the UK producing 30% of the fuel it needs. Australia is actually quite realistic as a production site, given that they're already starting to build a lot of green ammonia infrastructure, and they're quite well placed for delivery to Southeast Asia. The Middle East as well, there's a lot of investment happening there in green hydrogen and ammonia. So that West Africa part is perhaps one of the ones that's most in doubt, but the rest seems fairly suited. But thank you. Yes?
No, please.
Yeah, ask about the map. I should have put up the...
And I'm just wondering about the water requirement needs and trade-offs with other needs for that water. So some of those regions, especially by 2050, we're going to be a lot warmer, whatever we do with emissions. There's going to be a lot less water in some of those more arid regions. Is that taken into account in this modelling?
So we haven't done very detailed water use constraints on this model yet, but you'll note that a lot of these are very close to coastal regions. So a lot of the water that could be used as salt water, there's a lot of work happening on hydrogen production from salt water that seems to be implying actually the additional cost of producing the salt water wouldn't be that high. So that's kind of taken into account in some of the documentation we're writing, that actually the costs that are required wouldn't be that different using the water that's available from saltwater resource.
Thank you. I really like the purpose of the model is always right. The model is wrong, but maybe it's useful to start that conversation. I hope we'll dig into that more in the discussion. Definitely, I'm keen to ask like that interaction between you and DFT, but I think we should save that for the. Was there any other clarification questions people had burning? No. Okay. Well, thank you, Carlo. Okay. Next up, we have Anupama. Over to you. Thank you.
Right, morning everyone. You should be able to see me or hear me or both. Hopefully I'll just stand over here. So I am Head of Policy Engagement at the Smith School. And for those of you who don't know the Smith School, I think everybody does, it's based in the School of Geography, the Department of Geography and Environment. And it works on a number of themes, including energy, climate, water, food, biodiversity, and regenerative economy. And I came to this role from a research or academic background, and so I'd just like to spend my few minutes of time perhaps giving you a wider perspective of policy engagement at the Smith School and some of the challenges that we faced and some of the things that have worked. And the Smith School is filled with people who want to change things, who want to change policy, and we have something like 35 different research projects running at any one time. A lot of the programs actually originated from the Martin School and are supported by the Martin School. So we do a lot of collaborative work with the Martin School and other places in the university as well. And so in a way, one of the challenges that I faced when I came into my role was trying to work out how to show that the Smith School was more than the sum of its parts and was also aligned with what was going on in the university in environmental sciences research. And I thought it would be just useful to kind of align, to set out some of my thoughts around that, and then perhaps hear back from the audience and during the panel discussion on whether you think that makes sense or whether you think you face similar challenges or not. So, as I said, there's a lot of policy engagement happening at the Smith School. Across all of our projects and our programs, there are a multitude of opportunities to engage with policy. And so one of the challenges was to try to find out where we could have or where we could make the greatest impact and work out a sort of strategy for doing that and work out a set of tools for then engaging in those spaces. And I think the challenge that I would sum it up as is trying to map research to the policy space. And sort of one way of thinking about this when we strategized about it at the Smith School was, what if we think about policy spaces as in terms of the crowdedness? So in terms of the number of other voices that are trying to weigh in on a topic related to environmental science or on a policy debate, and also on the degree of differentiation between what the other voices are saying and what we're saying. What are we saying that's different? What are we saying that's more convincing? And where are the sort of gaps in the spaces where we can actually make connections with people who are also vocalizing our messages? And so I think if I mapped this out, and I'm an economist by training, so I like graphs, and so therefore I would think of a policy space that aligns with sort of research output as the top right quadrant over there, which is basically where is a space that's not that crowded and where we have a high degree of differentiation in what we're saying, and can we sort of target that space or map our output onto that space, find out who's working on that space, and then make the connections with people who want the information that we have. And I think that also there's a sort of an interface over to research and scholarship as well, because in essence, that is what we're trying to do when we work on scholarship. We're trying to push the boundaries of the scholarship in our respective fields, and that's one way in which to do it, to say something different, to enter a space which is not crowded. And so there's also this thing about which Alina referred to, which is the policy window. And so I think there's always this anticipation of the next policy window and having some tools in place to engage with that next policy window. And it's not just sort of a supply and demand-led thing where you have a set of research papers which are coming out at different points of the year, and then you have policymakers kind of asking for information. But it's more, we're trying to make it more of an iterative process and a process of kind of co-creation. Somebody mentioned co-design as well in the first session. And so in terms of tools, what we've tried to do is look at how we can shape the narrative based on evidence that's been produced via our research. Look at how we can provide data or tools to policymakers for this. So for instance, one of the projects that one of our researchers did was the Global Economic Recovery Observatory, which basically compiled all of the policies in the world which focused on fiscal recovery from the pandemic and the economic crisis. And then policymakers could go on to that and look for, and researchers could go on to that as well and look for data on that. Another way is, of course, sort of getting involved in expert advisory, and then we always have sort of the route of submitting evidence wherever we can. So try and get the research into the policy spaces when the opportunity opens up. And I think sort of another kind of challenge with this is that we're operating in the UK, of course, but also in multiple other countries. So we've got projects that look at, for instance, South America, or focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa, or South Asia. And there are lots of other multilateral platforms which the academics at the Smith School are engaged in. And so the mapping has really been quite challenging in that sense, to find that policy space where you can differentiate, and also where you can do it, not just in the UK, but across multiple countries. So I think just to kind of think about some examples of what's worked well and what hasn't worked that well. Maybe I'll focus on what's worked well, and then in the panel discussion, we can go into what hasn't worked that well. So one of the things that has kind of worked well is this rapid response model. And of course, Agile is all about that. But when talking to policymakers, often there's this sense that they're so busy negotiating the complexities of their organizations that they might have maybe 5 to 10% of their time to actually spend on making policy or implementing policy even. And so it helps to, and this is what I've heard from policymakers, it helps to have kind of a reliable, trusted source of information in a familiar format, which you can pick up on a topic when you're looking at that topic and thinking about formulating policy on that topic. And so the two sort of tools that we've used at the Smith School, the first one predates my time, but we've done a lot of it since I joined the Smith School as well, is the rapid response to policy debates. And that's basically picking up pieces of research which have been published, which have used proven methods, peer-reviewed methods, and doing some incremental primary analysis with that, with numbers, and being completely transparent about the numbers that go into it, the sources of data, the techniques that I use, and then putting them out there in 3 or 4 pages to policymakers and publishing them essentially on our website so that anyone can pick them up. And 2 examples of this that we did were in 2022 when we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We published, and the UK government response was to sort of double down on oil and gas extraction in the UK. We published some numbers around what was the opportunity cost of doing that long term. How far would it take us away from our net zero pathways in the UK? And what would be sort of the cost to consumers, for instance, of following that particular path. And we did some numbers around that and provided the data. It was picked up by a lot of policymakers. Doesn't seem to have made much difference, but that model basically worked in terms of engagement. Another recent sort of rapid analysis, which actually came out of researchers doing work here at the OMS as well, around the empirically grounded technology forecasts and the energy transition paper, was this thing around COP28, where COP28 policymakers wanted to put out an announcement to say we need to triple global renewables capacity by 2030. And so we thought, okay, what does this actually mean in terms of costs and learning rates and so forth? And so those researchers used that model and put out some quick numbers based on that, which we then passed on to policymakers at COP and also socialized it via our website and other platforms. So that's worked, that rapid response model has worked very well. And we make sure that it's peer reviewed and that it's robust, essentially. And then the second thing that's worked well is policy briefs, which of course Agile also does, and OMS does this very well as well, where you have a 1-page summary of actionable conclusions, and then you have everything else, the research kind of appended to it for those who want to go into the details of how it's done. And I think with the policy briefs, it's also been an example, a successful example, I'd say, of co-creation. So, for instance, one of the briefs that we did with the carbon removal program, the CO2RE program at the Smith School, was on business models for deploying GGR solutions, greenhouse gas removal solutions. And we co-created that with BASE, which is now DESNES, where they were putting out a consultation on the topic. And so we helped to look at some of the questions that should be included in their consultation and explore those a little bit, flesh those out a little bit. And we published the policy brief at the same time that the consultation came out. We also then submitted evidence to the consultation. And it was a nice sort of a nice round circle of kind of getting involved in policy and making sure that the research was out there as well. I think just another sort of quick example of what has worked well, and I think with this one, there's something that I think is kind of underplayed in policy influence and engagement throughout, which is the role of having a really kind of strong core team, the role of having an engine room, the role of the Oxford Policy Engagement Network, and all these various entities at Oxford that talk to each other quite a lot. And this collaboration can bring out some amazing sort of alignment, which then really does go to show up in policy impact as well. So one of the examples that I've just put on there is from the Future of Cooling program, which is housed in OMS and also at the Smith School. And when they came out with their paper on the impacts of rising temperatures on countries around the world and on the UK specifically, we then had this very nice alignment with putting it out there on the media, and then also doing that at the same time that the research briefings were hitting the policymakers' desks. And that sort of resulted in an inquiry on whether the UK needs a strategy for heat resilience. There was some serendipity involved in this as well, because the Environment Audit Committee at the time was looking to do an inquiry on something new, and so researchers on the Future of Cooling program sort of were able to leverage that. But I think just the broad point from this is that alignment works really well, and collaboration between different parts of Oxford works really well in this sort of sense. So I think that's kind of my last slide. I can talk about what's not worked well, but perhaps I'll save that for the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Anupama. Any immediate clarification questions or? Yeah.
Thanks, Anupama. Thank you. Do you use the rapid response model to respond to misinformation or reports that sort of, don't really hit the mark?
That's a great question. I think with that, I can't think of an example where we've done that explicitly, and I think with that we tend to go with academics responding to misinformation through giving quotations, because that gets out there more quickly as well. But that is one of the challenges, that when you put out something, you have to kind of be cognizant of the fact that it could be appropriate, the message could be appropriated, and you don't want the message to be appropriated in a way that's different from the intention. But I think this is a big challenge in the environmental science field, especially now.
At the back.
Thank you. You use the word policy. Do you consider that you may have a part in defining or helping to define strategy as opposed to policy, which sets the conditions for? And then the other thing I would just point out is that the governments have a process at the moment which is geared around a certain rate of change in the environment and also in international processes like conflict and corruption et al. I suspect we're moving into a more rapid changing environment, and those policy processes may actually begin to fail, hence the strategy requirement.
Yeah, that's a terrific point. Kind of differentiating between policy and strategy and maybe frameworks for engaging with policy. I mean, I don't know if I have a clear answer to that. I do think that, at least in my experience, the policy engagement process has been iterative. So there has been some causality. There have been policymakers coming along saying, well, what does this mean? Is this true? What does the research say? And then there have been instances of us going along and, let's say, putting out a rapid response to a policy announcement where we say, well, hang on, think about what does this, that we already have a plan. Let's say we have the Climate Change Committee's report, and what does this then do to taking us further away or closer to that balanced net zero pathway? So I think, I don't know, that's a really good question. I think that there are frameworks and plans out there, but like the Climate Change Committee report, and we have a legal obligation as well. But kind of making sure that we stay on track with that is perhaps one of the things that we can do with policy influencing strategy. I do agree that we're entering sort of a turbulent period where we will see, and we've already seen sort of a kind of a slowdown. We have a mission at the Smith School. Our mission is to get to net zero emissions by 2050 and sustainable economic development. And so all of the engagement we do is kind of centered around that. And that's kind of quite useful because then you have a lot of different research programs which also have their impact strategies and their impact frameworks. I think that's what I'd say on that point.
Thank you, Anupama. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, Carlo, please go. Yeah, please.
So you showed the example of like, you know, the paper on the increase in temperature and cooling leading to an article in The Conversation and the BBC, and then your policy brief being published. I was wondering if you could tell us like whose job it was, like who went out to press with like some of those following on from the academic paper, and at what point then you went in and decided, okay, we now make the policy brief. Was it seeing immediately the academic paper, or was it kind of post the conversation kind of being public and in the press? Like that, a bit more on that journey would be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I don't want to take credit for that, all of that, because that was the researchers. Second point is I think that's really where, I think that I'd say two things. One is that the process of planning for the engagement began way before the paper was published, because the researchers actually came to us and told us, look, we've got these results, we're about to submit, it's going to make a big difference, what can we do? That's sort of the first point. So there was a lot of lead time, so we could think about it, we could strategize, we could build contacts. The second thing is we had a really terrific comms team and a policy team at the Oxford Martin School and at the Smith School and various other places. And so one cannot really understate the impact of having a very strong core team, an engine room, a policy engagement network, because that is really what gets the collaboration over the line, and sort of we get the impact through the alignment of those things. So I think those three things sort of happened in parallel. There were lots of conversations, there was lots of translation of the research. And then of course we wanted to do what the researchers were comfortable with doing, and they were very eager to put their results out there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anupama. Right, so I'm going to be very liberal or a bit naughty in taking sort of chair's prerogative to add a few thoughts. I was really keen, before we break out into wider discussion. Oh, that's not very helpful. That'll do. I was really keen, before we move into discussion, to share an example from outside Oxford, because I think we've heard a lot about Oxford. Catherine obviously has given us some examples from outside Oxford and helped us see that bigger picture, and I think also Catherine's talk also really will help us hold our feet to the fire on making sure we're understanding this wider space we're moving in. But I wanted to look at an example from outside Oxford, but I think that had some interesting parallels to Agile. And so this is a research centre funded by ESRC and then a long list of government departments. The government departments put in quite small amounts of money, the ESRC put in a lot. NERC were also co-funders at the beginning, but then dropped out in the second phase. I think there's maybe interesting reasons about why that happened, some of it above my pay grade. But this was a kind of a similar setup in that sense, that it was Research Council funding, but then very closely connected with UK government. My role in this project was as knowledge integrator. So for me, this is one of the strange things about this project. I applied for a job. It was a research fellow job not long after my PhD, but the title was not research fellow, it was knowledge integrator. And just that in its own right for me was kind of a strange thing. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into. It's a kind of like vague, fuzzy term. And so that was, for me, felt like a barrier rather than an enabler. The project itself, it has, a horrible long acronym, as these projects do, the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. Really what we were doing was trying to develop and test new methods for policy evaluation. So whether that be simulation methods or new types of social science data collection or sort of co-creation and participatory methods, but bring those into policy evaluation. And there I mean like ex post, after the policies have been implemented, how is government evaluating, working out whether that worked or not. So we had a really focused, the topic was vague. It was across DEFRA, DESNES, Natural England, Environment Agency, food standards. The policy areas were broad, but the particular way we were engaging was much more targeted on its ex-post evaluation. Government spends a lot of money on that. There are people with job titles like policy evaluation, analyst, etc. in government. So we were really targeting a particular kind of stage of the policy process, which is one way to approach it. I think it has pros and cons. Then in terms of what we were doing, we had a bunch of what we called case studies, and these actually, I think, have very clear parallels to the sprints we do in Agile. These are co-developed kind of projects in their own right within the CCAN Centre, but that could emerge as we went, that we could kind of design as we went. They weren't specified in the original proposal. We were using, it's quite funny, this kind of thing of people using Agile methodology as a framing or as a kind of inspiration. So obviously in Agile methodology is kind of in the name, and then we talk about sprints, but we don't use much more, I think, of kind of a formal sense of Agile methodology taken from software development. Whereas in CCAN, we didn't put the language so at the forefront. We didn't talk about Agile in the same way, but we did try to adopt in these case studies Agile methodology. So I think there's an interesting open question about whether Agile methodology is useful in research and how much we should push towards that model or not. But we had this kind of long list of case studies where we tried to do things kind of similar to Agile sprints. Then we had a fellowship program, so we had a similar idea of people being embedded in different directions, but instead of focusing on researchers going out and being embedded in government, we did it kind of the other way, actually, and we had practitioners and policymakers who we would fund to then come and spend time with us. We then also targeted particular guidance. We thought, often you see evaluations done by government and they'll have like a line saying, must be compliant with the Magenta book, which is the kind of official Treasury advice on how to do evaluation. And so we said, we need to have some of our ideas in that guidance. So we targeted the guidance, HMT, the Treasury were putting out a new version of that guidance. And so we have an annex saying, here's how you should do our version of evaluation. Here's how you should bring some of these ideas. So we tried to implement there. Then we did kind of some of the more usual things where, as Anupama said, we had policy notes, we called them briefing notes, but this idea of summarizing things. We've done loads of webinars and really managed those kind of lunchtime webinars or breakfast webinars as a key entry point to get policy people to turn up and listen to the ideas. We've done a training program, and then we've had this other thing that I think is actually going to give it the longevity past the initial kind of block funding from ESRC is creating a spin-out. And so having a separate company, obviously the university, this is hosted at University of Surrey, they were very keen to have a spin-out. They liked the idea of that. But I think the real advantage of it is a lot of work to set that up, a huge amount of work to set up a spin-out company if you haven't done that before. But the real advantage is it gives you the flexibility to do smaller bits of work and bring in researchers who already have other jobs, and they can do extra kind of consultancy type work. So that is one model, I think, that allows there to be longevity of the research itself. In terms of big kind of hit you over the head lessons, some of them are obvious. I think some of them maybe are less. One was the co-production took much longer than we ever kind of thought it would. So it's just always kind of, I think multiply by 3 the amount of time you think that's going to take in any individual project. I think the fact that we existed as a center and could react to things quickly was vital. So in Agile, we tend to react to things, I think, kind of at a medium pace. We can do new work and we can design a new sprint, but there's kind of hoops we need to go through to do that. Whereas in CCAN, it really was we let the researchers have freedom to do what they want, and they could go off and do a little mini case study if they wanted to. We also had case studies that failed. I'm not sure all of them make it onto the website, but I'm quite keen that, if we're experimenting with these different models, we should have some failures, and we should share those in the same way that we share our successes. And I think, we did that. I'm not sure we shared them in the right way, but there were definitely failures and case studies that we put a bit of effort into and then just fizzled out. And that's normal because we're experimenting, but that's also normal because of the nature of the policy process and this engagement between two things which maybe are moving at different speeds. In terms of substantive stuff on the actual research, the biggest determinant of what methods we used or whether a case study went ahead was the timeline. So it really was, do we have enough time to do some simulation modeling? Do we only have enough time to do a rapid evidence review or a workshop, some systems mapping, whatever it might be. And that what was happening in terms of timescales absolutely determined what we did. It wasn't about what would be the best thing to do from a kind of analysis point of view. It was just the time frames. And then the other last issue I think that we experienced, because we had this narrow focus on evaluation, we then experienced a lot of kind of potential mission creep, where people would say, oh, I like the ideas you're doing here, you're talking about, but I'm not an evaluator. I do cost-benefit analysis, or I do policy design and engagement. Can we use it there? And so there was our focus gave us a lot of strength, and we could really target what we were doing, but we were constantly having to kind of discipline ourselves from not creeping off those topics. So there was a real trade-off there, I think, in terms of the focus. But yeah, so that's the CCAN example. I just wanted to share that just to bring a non-Oxford example into the mix. So yeah, any clarification questions or comments on that before we move into panel?
Just a clarification as to excellent initiative, and I was wondering how you sorted out the transdisciplinarity element between different epistemic communities engaging, especially when we're thinking that sprints, by the name, you need speed, and then you said that you multiply it by 3, the effort, and I think much of the effort is in terms of translating the languages or the ways people engage from different disciplines and to converge into something. How did you deal with that in CCAN?
Yeah, in CCAN, the CCAN is the way we say the long, horrible acronym. In terms of, interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, I think we basically sidestepped that particular problem in CCAN because we focused in on ex post policy evaluation as like that bit of the policy process. And so 90% of that is kind of social and economic research, trying to work out what the economic impact of a policy was, whether it was effective in meeting its immediate goals, and not its long-term goals, which might have been sustainability or reductions in emissions or different measures of biodiversity, whatever. We weren't evaluating, did we hit those? We were evaluating those much more immediate outputs of like, did that thing we did affect stakeholders in that system? Did it have a positive impact for them to then take into their work? So we kind of narrowed a bit, and I think that focus allowed us we didn't have to deal with so much of that interdisciplinary issues, where I think in Agile we absolutely are grappling with that, and we're bringing together natural scientists and social scientists and everyone else in between. Yeah, so that's a bigger problem in Agile, I'd say.
I have a question about the CCAN limited spin-out, and whether you could say something more about how that complemented what you were doing. Because it does feel like spin-outs are more kind of understood in the natural sciences, let's say. So this is different, and also it feels like there's a space where policymakers feel comfortable interacting with organizations like Green Alliance and those types of organizations. So does a spin-out help universities bridge that space in environmental science research, do you think?
I think so. I think this one, the real reason that this had legs and ran and has grown is because it allowed us to deal with smaller chunks of funding coming in and deal with them in a much more rapid way. So as researchers in a university, we need there to be 2 years, maybe at least a minimum of a year, but ideally kind of 2 or 3 year funding projects ahead. Otherwise, it doesn't make much sense for the university, and you get the finance people saying to you, this is not so good from our overheads perspective, and we're not sure we should be engaging on these kind of lots of small grants. But that's, in the evaluation space at least, that's the kind of modes that the government wants to commission. So if you're trying to bid for work in that way, I think you need the spin out to pick up those smaller pieces, and then maybe you grow from there. But I guess that's very dependent on the nature of work in evaluation. In domains where grants are bigger and longer, and that's more the norm, then maybe that makes more sense. The other thing I think you're kind of starting to butt into is where consultancy should be playing a role. And we had partners and practitioners in the project who were consultants, who their day job was in a private company bidding for government work. And they would get sometimes annoyed with us because they'd say, well, you're coming in and you need to be careful you're not just kind of undercutting us by being a slightly cheaper, not-for-profit version of what we do as consultancy. So the line between what CCAN Limited was doing and what the research centre in the universities was doing and what consultants are doing gets quite blurry and problematic, actually. So I think that was a challenge. I think for Agile it's less the case, because I think we've got a much stronger focus on doing kind of core primary research, whereas because policy evaluation is much more about this kind of policy research, policy analysis, it gets blurrier. Sorry, I can go off on one for too long on those. Okay, I think what we should do now is have all of the panelists come up, and then we should take some more questions from the audience. Yeah, if you want to come up. No, however you feel comfortable. Like, yeah. So I think we've got kind of half an hour, 45 minutes if we want, or we can, if people are feeling hungry, we can go to lunch a bit earlier. I have a list of kind of questions. I've scribbled down lots of things that came up, but I'm very keen to take questions from the audience first. I don't want us just to talk at you. So what wider themes did you see there? What thoughts did that kind of spark? Are there questions? I'm sure there are questions. Yeah, let's take a few.
A lot of you spoke about science communication, and either directly or indirectly in terms of its impact in media, but science communication more generally. There's a lot of literature on science communication specifically, and I was just wondering what your personal experiences were, whether this is synthesized enough to researchers, especially with a policy focus, and whether, I suppose, you feel equipped, especially from an early career perspective, to have effective conversations with policymakers. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Who would like to have a...
I could try and say something. No. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. I think it helped a little bit that I have a background in teaching, and so I had been relatively comfortable, talking about science at different levels for different people. One of the difficulties with our project specifically is that modelling is quite a specific type of evidence that has its own complexities, often to do with the fact that there are masses of assumptions sitting behind what looks like potentially quite a neat output, and being able to communicate the value of that is something that some stakeholders were quite accustomed to. There's a few people within DFT, the team that we were working with, that were very used to working with models and approach them with the right level of skepticism and also the right level of kind of insight to be able to say, that I can see being useful in, these kinds of scenarios that we can play around with. And others who would come in and say, that's incredible, that's it, that's like solved, and we'd be there like, no, there is a lot of uncertainty behind a lot of these things. So it's a strange one, modeling specifically, coming in and being able to, but I think there is always a level at which you can make clear what the assumptions that you think are the most important behind any work you do, and being upfront about that and being very honest about that also creates a lot of I think trust with the stakeholders. And I think that's the key point we found with communication was if people felt like you were being honest with them and you were very easy to ask questions to, then actually you'd have many opportunities to kind of fix that communication, because it became a relationship. And if they ever had doubts, they know that we would be open to having those discussions. So I think that's a small takeaway, I guess. Like, the communication doesn't necessarily have to be exactly perfect for everyone in the room at the first time you're talking to them, if you can start relationships with these people that go on over a period and you're open to answering the questions that they come with. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can offer just one other thought on that. I think just from a general perspective, I think it's useful to think about yourself as an academic or an early career researcher. You are an expert in your field. And I think as academics, we're trained to question the question. We're trained to find the truth and to tell the truth. And quite often, policymakers who are faced with a policy problem are looking for the best available answer to that policy problem at the time. And I think that it sort of helps to also look at a situation in that perspective. Because when you're communicating something, it's still very useful in that perspective. So yeah, just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've found the science communication bit really easy with policy people because they basically, I feel like you don't have to dumb down that much and you should kind of trust that they understand the system just as well as you do. The place that it's painful is when someone asks you to like write or read like a press release or something, and there you really are, you feel very uncomfortable the way something's being summarized or like represented. But in a policy space, I feel we shouldn't be too scared.
If I may add something, this trust we were talking about here, it requires time. It's time consuming. And as researchers, we also are measured by our publications. So, and when you are doing this engagement, you're not really writing your scientific studies, publishing. So then it's also something to manage because it's time consuming. It's not delivering in scientific papers, and we need better metrics to measure our impact as researchers working on the science to policy.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if any of you did any engagement in various forms with NGOs, because they are policy influencers and they are usually really, it's the sort of bread and butter of their job is engaging with the policy-making community. So I'm wondering if you sought to learn from them, for starters, and secondly, whether you sought to engage with them in asking them what questions they would like answers to in order for them to do their job more effectively.
Thank you. Yeah, anyone?
Yeah, I had a work in 2019 on soil moratorium in Brazil, and it was really a flagship for NGOs trying to protect Cerrado biome. So in Brazil, we talk a lot about Amazon, but other biomes, they also need protection. So it was really a campaign from the NGOs to protect Cerrado. We were doing modeling, and the most difficult part was the timing. They wanted results very quickly, and we were keen to adjust our models, but it takes time. In my case, in my research, it was time-consuming to change our models, our data, and producing the results, and they needed that in a very short time. The window of opportunity was short, so it was one of the main challenges to work with NGO back that time. In my personal experience, was this adjusting the time of research that is usually slow, and the time of answers and action.
Thank you. The main NGO that we ended up working with during the last project was the Global Maritime Forum, who are an international organization of kind of voluntary members and who make contributions essentially for the GMF to lead research and policy and engagement activities with industry and governments. They do a huge amount of work kind of coordinating a lot of initiatives, and we've learnt a lot from them. So we first worked with them during the first workshop we hosted and kind of got some contacts there that led to them asking us whether we wanted to participate in one of their projects, which was looking at a green corridor between Singapore and Rotterdam. And working on that has been really illuminating because they took industry engagement to a next level compared to anything that we'd ever done. So all of the research that had been done to model out the costs of this potential green corridor with some of our inputs, they then called in for 2 different workshops, like a dozen different major international industrial representatives. And you know, my supervisors were initially a little skeptical in that, like, you know, we have a lot of the expertise on some of this, like asking the fuel producers to kind of rubber stamp what we're doing doesn't feel really that academic in a way. But actually what we've learned is that it's not necessarily about, you know, some ammonia producer coming in and rubber stamping what we've researched. It's more about building that relationship with them so that the discussion can continue, and inviting them into our research a little bit is actually really valuable. So I think working with the GMF as an NGO has taught us that lesson as well as many others.
There's just to build on that. So that's an interesting type of NGO, right? Because there's different types of NGOs. They're more of like a trade association, maybe. They're quite sort of central in their political position, maybe. They're not kind of radical or on the kind of more critical of what government's doing. I think one of the feedbacks I've had when we've talked about working with NGOs is it creates a reputational risk, or somehow it's going to irritate government that we've partnered with them and we're inevitably more focused on government. And so, there's a balance there. There comes with an extra risk, maybe, I think, is the feedback I've had, at least. I don't know whether that's true or not, but Maritime Forum is a very nice example of maybe someone's easier to engage with.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with both of you. So it comes back to what Catherine said this morning about being honest broker or issue advocate. And I guess a lot of NGOs are issue advocates. But I think that where there's a lot of value in sort of building relationships and having relationships with people working in NGOs, like having those networks, is that they really have their finger on the pulse of legislation. What legislation's coming out when it's going through. And so it's a very good, if you tap into those networks and you have a piece of research, you know that when you're timing the release of a particular piece of research, you have a sort of a sense of what the policy landscape looks like, whether what you're saying is kind of directly in conflict with something else that's happening at that time. And that just helps you to plan for it, to plan the messaging. So when we did our rapid response pieces, we wanted feedback on them, and we wanted to know what else they were feeding into, the kinds of policy debates that were happening. And I think that the nature of the rapid response was that we were relying on numbers, and that kind of protected us from taking any sort of stance or anything. We were saying, these are the facts. So I think there's a lot of value to working with NGOs and certainly developing those networks. But again, as researchers, we there are these concerns around, are we then being labeled in a particular way? Good point.
Yeah, I think working with anyone, I guess, you then affect the way you're labelled to someone else.
Yeah.
Tara, I think you've done a lot of work with NGOs yourself, right? How have you found those relationships? How have you built those? Like, what's worked or what hasn't?
Thanks. I mean, I think you can annoy them because you won't, they want you to do the work that is going to prove their point, and that's not what our job is. But I do feel that often they're asking the questions that researchers are scrabbling to catch up with, formulating a good way of answering sometimes. So I do think they're ahead of the game in lots of ways. I think it's important to talk to everybody, but not take money from anyone, which is quite difficult as well. But I do think it's a fine walk to tread, but I also recognise the point that not taking a stance is also taking a stance, and I think as researchers we all have to kind of think about that.
Maybe some of the moral philosophy we heard about earlier can help us with that. Other questions or comments?
On your future of cooling, which was stellar and dramatic, and you work very well at the end. But do you have an example where you put something out, it didn't work, you have not taken, and what have you learned from it?
Gosh, I mean, I can't, there are so many examples, I can't think of a single one. 90% of the stuff you try doesn't work. And then, so as I said, it's sort of there is serendipity involved. I think with this particular, with the future of cooling stuff, we planned it, we timed it, so it was released in the summer when everyone was, suffering with the heat. And so that was a really nice, and we had a lot of collaborative work that we did. So, I'm trying to think of another example. I suppose another example might be the Global Economic Recovery Observatory, where researchers at the Smith School, I think in collaboration with the Blavatnik, were putting together this database of policies. And that was less media focused and more policy focused. So we started getting a lot of attention from governments, and particularly from ministries of finance, that were trying to figure out what to do and how to respond to the economic environment that was created after the pandemic. So maybe that's, and I think that did get some media attention, but again, I have to say that predates my time at the Smith School. So that might be one example. Pete might have some great examples.
Definitely, yeah. The things we failed on in CCAN were where someone came to us and said, we want to work on this policy area, we'd like to do this thing, and then we would then basically have a workshop or a kind of relatively large meeting where we bring together the researchers and the various teams. And we would just, through that, and it would get quite excruciating, through that 2 or 3 hour meeting, realize that they just weren't very impressed with what we were offering, or that we didn't have the capacity to do the analysis they wanted. And yes, that process, in the ideal world, it would happen in one session, but sometimes that could be multiple meetings over a month or not, and you've already by that time kind of put on the website, yes, we're doing some work on this, we're exploring this, but actually it then just fizzles out to nothing. So that we had lots, I think, of those kind of examples where the match wasn't right. And I think the other ones were where it politically went the wrong way, where the message that our analysis was offering wasn't helpful politically, and so then they just had to, the departments didn't want us to publish anything. And so we should say in CCAN there were non-disclosure agreements between the censor and the department, and so they had, that sounds like we can't say anything, but we could publish stuff with sign-off. But it was then work was done, it would say something about Brexit, maybe because this was 2016, 17, 18. It would say something about Brexit. Politically, that was unacceptable to have that then put out, and so that work was then just maybe useful, but buried, wasn't in a policy brief, wasn't in a journal article, and maybe it'll come out in a few years, but it's, yeah. So there was, I think the political issue drove a lot of, yeah, that's one type of failure maybe. No.
Thank you. Just building on that last comment about, it'd be interesting to hear panelists' views on how do you build sort of that resilience into your work, resilience to political turmoil, to ensure that you're doing a piece of brilliant research that is sort of just important in of itself and relevant potentially to lots of different sorts of political agendas. It's just really important information that we need in order to develop sustainably or have flourishing economies. So you might not be able to shoehorn it into a particular policy window, but it kind of doesn't matter because it's arguably relevant for many, or for a multiplicity of possible windows that might emerge. And so there's that striking the balance between the specificity and that having immediate impact if that policy window stays there, and just sort of general goodness that can be adapted to different windows. I don't know whether you could sort of speak to that, or maybe a journey you might have had where you might have had to course correct a bit, but the fundamental science underneath it is still what it is. And it's good.
You've had a good experience.
You were nodding.
Yeah, from our experience, when we started to design the mini sprint, we didn't have the favorable policy in place. So we were mainly talking to global stakeholders, and it's also important to mention that we are doing research in the UK to influence policy in Brazil. The fact that I'm Brazilian helps a lot. My previous network helps a lot, but also it's important to have collaborations with partners there. So then we were looking at a research question that was connected to a global problem. And when the policy window came, which was mainly the change in government, we were already working on that. So this, in our work, this ability to find ways to communicate with a global audience and also the local audience was really important to navigate through this political turmoil. So when Bolsonaro was in place, we were engaging with DEFRA people. But when the government changed, we were there, and the people we were engaging at DEFRA is also in contact with stakeholders in Brazil. So the basis, we were building this basis, even though it didn't seem really clear. And when the change came, so we were kind of ready with the tools, building our network in the background, and luckily the new government is interested in science-based results. But again, managing expectations, there is no guarantee they are gonna use our results. So it's also another point, because we are putting a lot of effort on building on this networking, building, creating trust between us. But at the end, we are going to provide numbers for the next NDC, but are they going to use that or not? We also have to manage these expectations.
On the Brazil example, just because I've had not anywhere near as much as Aline, but a little bit of experience of this, what ended up happening is we kind of had whiplash in that at first it was like, no, don't engage too much with, you can't engage at all with the political level, and don't do anything too visible with civil servants because you'll cause them trouble to their political masters. And so it was very downplayed. But then the second the government changed, it was like, oh, actually, no, that co-I on the project, that professor in Brazilian University X, is now Minister of State for X, for Y, you know. So it was a sudden shift because the political and academic communities there are so much more tightly connected that you have academics becoming part of the government, right? So it went from, one end of the spectrum to the other. And I don't think there's any way to like deal with that. I don't know how you do it, but like, we didn't deal with it in the project this happened at all. We'd had no solution. We were getting thrown around, getting whiplash in that process. Yes.
So with regards to the timeline of the Sprint application, had you approached one or more potential stakeholders before actually submitting the application? So something along the lines of, we have this grant proposal, not sure if it's going to be successful, but is it something you might be interested in?
I wasn't there for, sorry, is this on? Doesn't matter. Now it is. I wasn't there to write the proposal, but it is my understanding that for our research sprint, DFT was contacted in the creation of the proposal, very much a couple of months ahead, and they'd shown interest. So as part of the proposal, we could say these are going to be our key stakeholders, and there is a contact there who's interested in the results, yeah.
I think my understanding across most of the sprints is that absolutely is done, and we should do more of that and always do that if we can. But I think it creates a challenge in that when you're not sure that funding's coming through, you raise expectations, you take up people's time, and so I think there's an art to managing that I don't think we've necessarily cracked, and it just falls back on the quality of those relationships. So if those are longer term relationships beyond any individual project or individual piece of funding, then hopefully they can survive those shifts of when a piece of funding doesn't come through or not, would be my hope. But no, I think there's a risk there that we can create expectations sometimes. Any other comments on that theme? How about with the slightly different model you've talked about in the Smith School of kind of rapidly responding to things? Have you ever had the issue of kind of generating interest or generating like people expect something that you can't then deliver on, or is that?
I think at the Smith School we've been fortunate to be able to do the rapid responses off of things we are already doing. And then we have had interest from people saying, oh, but that's really interesting. Can you then do a more detailed version of that? And then you start to look for funding to do the more detailed version of whatever it is. But I mean, just sort of falling on Carlo's point that with the ammonia sprint, I think a lot of the blocks of it were ready in the were there in the beginning, and I think also maybe sort of demonstrating that there's a gap or a need for that in the 9-month period that the sprint will run over is perhaps also quite a useful thing to have, which I think with the ammonia thing it did, because the International Maritime Organization had a target. We knew that there were lots of policy kind of milestones or check-in points coming up. So, you know, it's kind of aligning the two really helped with that one. So, yeah, don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Thank you, Anupama. Any other questions or thoughts from there? No?
I was just wondering about this whole tension or evolving dynamic between the role of the universities and the research community versus the role of consultancies. And because I think it's very germane to it might be germane to the conversation we're having about the work we do, as the Smith School example shows me really, and indeed Aline's work, and indeed, in fact, all examples are talked about, really anchored into that core fundamental science, disciplinary, applied science that's going on, and being opportunistic then about, through a co-creation with policymakers, but still being a bit more opportunistic, so that if that opportunity disappears, you're still anchored into this sort of body of really valuable work that could potentially be tailored to different audiences as things goes along. So you're not sort of political turmoils all over the place, up and down, up and down, up and down, switching governments every 5 minutes, left, right switches and all the stuff that's going on. But you're not sort of taking the roller coaster ride as a research institution, whereas consultancies, I guess, they are doing that. They're going quickly, some things emerged. Oh no, it hasn't, then what, you know? And it's like, oh, is that what we're sort of talking about? Is that like a kind of, I'm just thinking about drawing out the discussion. And is that any different from how we've been in the past? Or is it, if we're wanting to change how we're doing things, how does that? Well, I'd love to hear what panelists had to thought about that relationship. You actually, Pete, talked about the fact that you did actually set up a consultancy. Did that change the dynamic of how the research community was then identifying its role in all of this?
Any comments? Please, you go.
No, I think that's a great point, Nat. I think it's. I think we have had this conversation as well in the Smith School. You know, our mission is education. It's research and education, and that anchors everything that we do. So sometimes when we put the rapid response out, we do it off our own steam. Nobody is funding us to do it or anything like that. And I think that sort of protects us against that. But we're not a think tank. We're not an advocacy organization. We are an educational institute. And I think coming back to that is sort of quite useful. And also everything that we publish is then is publicly available via our website or other kind of avenues. So I think it's a difficult one, because often you get philanthropists, let's say, saying, oh, but you know, you should be doing more on policy, you should be engaging on this, that, and the other, and then we have to come back to make the point that, look, we are an educational institution. We do want to change the world, but we want to do it through this kind of anchor of, and this base of having rigorous research, and then translating that into education. And I guess there are other avenues to do it, right? Through the exec ed that we do at the Smith School, through the great programs that we've set up. So there are other ways to do that, to kind of differentiate us from what the consultants do or what the think tanks do. But it's tough. It's a tough one to field.
Can I ask you, maybe this is, where do you see the distinction between the type of modelling you were doing? And maybe this applies to Aline too, but I really thought about it when you were speaking. Where's the difference between what a large engineering consultancy like Atkins or Mott MacDonald, or there's lots of them who do lots of modelling and digital twins and all this kind of stuff, and are very good at marketing it. Where's the distinction between the type of modelling you were doing in this sprint and that type of work? Is there a clear distinction, or is it a bit blurry?
It's not a very clear distinction. It just happens to be in a space that hasn't been looked at yet. And I think that's one of the advantages that research institutions have, is to be slightly more long-term thinking and look at opportunities that are further down the line than just very immediate modeling that these consultancies do. But in some ways, I believe that like a lot of these consultancies might be sitting on proprietary tools that we would love to have to hand and not have to code everything from scratch or open source packages that are just about doing this. But there is also, we don't really necessarily know what's behind a lot of the stuff that they're producing and putting out. So I think the lines are really blurred in terms of the kind of work that's possible to be done by us and by these consultancies, and they could go hand in hand a lot more perhaps. One of the small points I wanted to make on the question was just that one of the challenges that we had in our sprints was literally being able to hire somebody quick enough. Like, I was meant to start at the beginning of the sprint and only was able to join like 5 months in because of the university timings in actually hiring people. There might be other parts of the university that aren't the engineering department that are maybe quicker at putting out job ads and hiring than they were. But I think from my supervisor's perspective, it's something that's quite common in academia, that there is this slowness to a lot of the processes which consultancies and spin-outs aren't necessarily bound to, for better or for worse. Like, a lot of these systems are slow in universities for good reasons of fairness and transparency and all of that. But being able to just, point to a consultancy and very quickly say, okay, we've got this budget, can you do this in the next 3 months, go, can be very useful when there's these short-term deadlines and projects and somebody wants insight fast. I think that's all I've got on
that. On the question Peter made about the consultancies, the overlaps with our research, McKinsey, they released the net zero plan for Brazil, and comparing those researchers or products, let's say, the McKinsey piece has a huge focus on the agribusiness and showing how the agribusiness can be the way to achieve net zero. And it's particularly different from our results. That's interesting to see. And I think we, in research, we have more freedom to choose, to find our, to progress. I don't know, I cannot say, but it's interesting, at least in this net zero pathway, comparing our research. So the one led by a consultancy has a huge focus on agribusiness, and ours doesn't see, and I can explain why, not now, why it doesn't have, the agribusiness is not going to solve the net zero puzzle in Brazil. So it was one thing, and answering Ned's question, I think we need to partner with different communities, engage with different sectors, let's say. So have a good communication with government, but also with NGOs, also in academia. So we have to manage to speak to all these audiences at the same time, because when one channel is blocked, we still have other channels to communicate. So, yeah.
Sorry, there's one more thought I wanted to add to the distinction between the role of consultancies and academia that I think we've found in our project, which is often to engage with a consultancy, you have to go with a question, and the consultancy will then try and deliver on that more specific thing. A lot of the time we found of our project working with DFT and other stakeholders, they didn't quite know what question they wanted to ask. And so our role kind of became advisory in that capacity, saying, yes, you should engage a consultancy to look at this when the sprint is over, because we aren't going to be able to do everything right now. You're going to have more questions, but this is an area you should be focusing on and trying to to pay for more research on, even if it is from the private sector and not from academia, because they'll be able to deliver something. But giving that direction initially came from us for this project and was very much a part of what we were able to deliver. It was also like a bit more focus for future work.
Yes, at the back.
Just a comment, really. Remember, there are private organisations there to make money, and they will have within that company almost a cognitive bias. They've built something, and they're going to sell something, and they don't want to change something because that's cost, and that reduces profit. So they will tend to take their customer in a particular line because that's the line that's the best profitability. I would say to you guys, not that you should disregard that relationship between academia and the private sector, because there is a powerful synergy there if you can establish it. But and do not lose sight of the fact that you are the guardians of the scientific method. And actually, if you look at what's happening at the moment, potentially there's an awful lot of change going to happen, and some of those climate models that have been built on previous understanding may actually require an awful lot of change. And in that change, there's going to be all hands to the pump, so to speak, where actually you and the private sector need to work together, because actually a lot of the policy people need to be making the best possible decisions they can, because the ramifications are quite extreme.
Yeah, thank you. That really resonates with what the experience in CCAN. So we had often the work that CCAN Limited, the spin-out, would be actually go and respond to a call to deliver an evaluation, whereas in the research centre in university, we would work on methodology and we'd talk about improving the methodology. And so we would make that distinction, absolutely. We have sort of 10, 15 minutes left if we want to use it. I have one big, broad, kind of very reflective question I would like to ask, but I'm keen if there's any other comments or questions, people who feel like they haven't spoken yet, or themes they would like to come up, haven't come up yet.
I'm keen, inspired on the Brazilian case, I'm keen on considering the marginalized voices that sometimes governments are not keen and include in, say, for instance, COP28 or environmental summits. The indigenous, faith-based, gender, you name it, there's several layers of marginalization. And keen to the academic research method of being transdisciplinary, we need to include those voices to be more transformative and also address socio-ecological injustice. And I'm keen to know what your experiences are regarding the inclusion of the marginalized, very much so in the times of Bolsonaro. But now you have the other side of the coin, which is everyone may be included now with the Lula time. But this applies to all. The marginalized voices are normally in governments marginalized. NGOs may bring those voices in, but policymakers tend to have them as token participants, especially in focus groups and stuff. This is myself and going to COP28, and I know that is happening all the time, and there's a lot of greenwashing in terms of how that's done. So, thank you.
That's a very, very important comment. Yes, during Bolsonaro, all the channels to civil society, they were blocked. Now with the changing in government, we see more openness for civil society. This year, the government is relaunching the existing plans, like the plan for deforestation control. It exists for a long time, but it was stopped, and now this year they launch it again and open up for civil society comment, so we see more openness on that. And in our research, we are not really directly involving the marginalized voices, but indirectly, yes, because when we say that we need nature-based solutions, to drive the journal, a credible journal to net zero, we are implicitly saying that we need to protect, restore, and adapt and take into account people on the ground to deliver on nature and people. So we are indirectly doing that. And one of the aims of our research is also to help on a long-term trajectory, what's the name? Long-term strategies. So countries, they have to submit long-term strategies. There is a component on targets, but also it has to incorporate and have the transition in an equitable and just way. So in our case, our results indirectly connect, but being there, or when we have this channel and build this trust, we can also always mention those points. I see more openness this time, but again, at the end, it's a political decision. We do our best trying to communicate science results, but at the end, yeah, the decision that doesn't belong to, we don't have this control on the outcome or the final decisions.
Just make a very, very small comment, because our research print it's a very much not focusing on like bringing in diverse voices. It's a very kind of long-term thinking system design that in some ways is quite abstract, but I think in a very small way, the Agile project enabled us to bring in more people than ever would have been in this kind of project. Like some of the early workshops that we held, you know, I've mentioned DFT and the GMF taking part and all of that, but actually one of the things that was most exciting, because we kind of created this first workshop in quite an open manner where we sent out invites, but we said, you know, anyone that's kind of in this sector, in the area, and would like to drop in, shared through lots of academic and non-academic contacts, meant that we had people from other departments coming in and engaging with this topic that they probably wouldn't have if we didn't have the kind of push from Agile to actually do some slightly non-traditional engagement work as part of our deliverables. That meant we had some kind of local business representatives, some ship designers who you know, are very small players in this very big, you know, global industry, but we got to hear about their concerns and the kind of smaller scale work that they're doing that we haven't modeled yet, but being able to hear their concerns about something that might be coming down the line in 20 years was really valuable. So in a very, very small way, which is very different to, you know, making sure that kind of at national level voices are heard, I think the Agile Sprint kind of philosophy of non-standard engagement being important actually helped us to do a little more engagement on something that is even so kind of engineering-y that you might not think it would merit that much engagement, but it does, and having this format really, really helps. Hearing from like local businesses and local voices that, you know, they can then feel involved, and actually we hear concerns that we might then, you know, drive future research with. It was really helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. I wouldn't undersell it, actually. I think my response to the question is similar in some ways, is that what you want to do is, we talk about co-design with a particular policy partner, but I think you also want, part of this model of doing research can be very participatory, which is a slightly more old-fashioned version of the same thing, I think, where you're saying at that early stage of the research process where you're deciding on the questions, on the focus, on the methodologies, you bring in as many voices as you can, and you need to think about what is the methods or the process through which that can be done. And so in CCAN, most of the time, we were talking about our methodological innovation. A big chunk of that was just doing the same stuff they're doing, but doing it in a far more participatory way, and doing the thinking with as many stakeholders as possible, but at an early process. And, you know, individual departments would say, oh no, we want to get our thinking straight before we then do consultation. Or we want to get our story straight before we go out and make this public or speak to people. And we would push and say, no, the whole point is you need to get your story straight and get that narrative right, with people in the first place, and you should go in with a blank page. And so I think that's part of the contribution, I think, to trying to bring in different voices, and that in every different project that will look very different. I do feel for people in government that they are held to a very high level of, like, they need to know exactly what they're doing and have a perfect story all the time. They need to pass the Daily Mail test or whatever. They're held to account. So sometimes they're very scared of bringing in lots of voices early when they haven't made up their mind already. So there's a tension there. Did you want to add anything to that?
Not personally, but I think my colleagues at sort of Oxford Net Zero are doing so much in terms of capacity building and engagement through a youth for climate training, through training policymakers to engage in these multilateral processes and to give them more of a stake and a voice in those processes. So I think that there's a lot going on in that space.
Thank you. Well.
Sorry, another question, but it reminds me of something that Catherine said earlier about the areas of research interest revealing what questions are not being asked, and there's some connection between that and what you're saying about inclusivity, that these are all political questions, and they're not. It's not like the default setting is a bilateral research and policy one, or the default setting is actually unilateral research orientation. It's not bilateral, it is multilateral, and this is political consensus among the people who are involved as to who can be in the room. And I think some of that requires us to let go of the idea of engagement being a science, because there's a certain amount of science that can help us do it better, but also a craft that we have to acquire over time. I mean, sorry, maybe craft's a short word. Competence and skill, and learning from your experience of mismanaging the inclusivity to do it better. It also makes me think, some of you have we talked about sprints and long runs, that sometimes we frame the question of what has worked around a time frame that we can kind of fit in our heads, and that, what do they call it in poker, where you think that you've won because you had a great hand, and you don't think about all the luck that was involved in you winning the hand. I think that some of these things, like I'm thinking of an individual who's involved in that cooling paper, and how I know a tiny bit more of that than you can fit on a PowerPoint slide, but only a tiny bit. And I think part of it was that another university invited a bunch of policymakers into a room and said, what kind of inquiry should we have? Then you have the inquiry, then they might be an advisor to the inquiry. And 15 years from now, all of the craft that's been acquired through that has impacts that at the moment we kind of dimly anticipate. Sorry, long sentence.
Yeah, absolutely, comment well taken, yeah. I'm very conscious of time. I think it's just about 1:30. If there's any particularly burning comments or questions people have, I'm happy to take one more. The question I had was the question on inclusivity and bringing that in, and that we kind of hinted at in Patrick's slides right at the beginning. Right, we had this circle of things that make up sprints, and one of them is equality, diversity, and inclusivity. So I'm glad we got to that. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, I think what we'll do now is have our hour-long lunch break. So yeah, if we could just say thank you very much to the panel here. Thank you to all for your questions.